Hello and welcome to another installment of Unsung Heroes, the series where we take a look at cars which are undervalued or underappreciated, vehicles which deserve to be talked about more. Maybe they're just cars that most people haven't heard of, maybe they're super obscure, maybe they weren't that successful at what they tried to do, but at the same time some of them, even though they weren't successful, have at the very least displayed an interesting alternative to the more mainstream established options of either road production or racing, and sometimes they might have bright ideas that weren't necessarily executed in the best way. That is more often than not the case, and unfortunately for this car, that is the case. The vehicle in question is a race car which not many people talk about and not many people know about in general, especially not compared to many other typical Le Mans cars. This car was designed specifically with the 24-hour race in mind. It's a Group 6 machine. It's a British car called the Piper Gtr. Now this car comes from a company, Piper, who don't make that many cars. I believe the total vehicle production of the entire company's life was something like 90 or 100 cars. They've hardly made any. The owners' club, I believe, has like 32 members. It's a pretty tiny company, but sometimes those companies have so much charm, and I would say that this is one of those occasions. Now they do have a road car called the P2 in its later form, originally called the GTT, and that car I'm not really a huge fan of, to be honest. It's got quirky looks, but not in a way that appeals to me. This one, though, does, much more so. Now, in the racing world, especially back in the olden days of the 60s and 70s, pretty much everyone who knows anything about Le Mans cars and race cars knows that the GT40 is kind of a big deal because of how low it is, 40 inches tall, hence the name. This car is a lot lower than the GT40. In fact, technically you could call this one the GT30, because this car is only 30 inches tall. That's literally a quarter less of the height of a Ford GT40 in comparison. That is crazy flat. Now this car has remarkable aerodynamics. It has a drag coefficient of 0.28, which is, let's just say, very good. Now the engine fitted in this car was not necessarily as impressive on paper as you might hope. It doesn't have some crazy V12 or a huge American V8. It's powered by a 1.3 litre, 155 horsepower Ford twin-cam engine. It's mid-engine rear-wheel drive, and the engine bay, I believe, can be fitted with a larger engine if requested or required, up to a V8 even. But they didn't do that. Now, had they done that, especially with an old American V8, they might have actually done a little bit better, because here's the story. The car was created for the 1969 Le Mans. Unfortunately, though, it failed to qualify because they went in for scrutineering of the engine, that kind of stuff. Some blunders were made with telling the team what had and hadn't been checked in time, and when they actually got out to do the race, they suffered some mechanical issues and ultimately didn't qualify in time to actually be eligible. Now that's a real shame, because this car, even with 155 horsepower, can do 164 miles per hour. That is seriously impressive. In fact, it's one of the very few race cars which has a top speed which exceeds its power. That's pretty impressive when you think of it that way. Now, the weight on this car is, as you'd probably assume, especially with a tiny engine, very low. It only weighs 600 kilos, which is very impressive. Even for a race car back then, that's pretty light. That's a lot lighter than stuff like the Ferrari P4s and the GT40s. Unfortunately, it didn't qualify, as I said, but if it had, it would have been very interesting to see how this car's alternative way of accomplishing the same thing, albeit at high speed, would have gone down. Would it have been good enough to win? Would it have been good enough to keep up? Reliability issues aside, if it had qualified, how would it have performed? Now in the full race, of course, reliability is a huge issue. That's tantamount to performance in the Le Mans, because there's no point in being fast if you can't finish the race. So this car unfortunately lacked in that respect. So even if it had qualified, it would have probably broken down somewhere on the way, given that the engine did break down even in qualifying. Which is why I mentioned earlier that if they had gone for that American V8, not necessarily a huge one, maybe a small block V8, not necessarily for the increase in power, but because those engines were pretty bulletproof back then, especially compared to a lot of, let's say, other engines from Europe, for instance. Now, it did use a Ford unit, but I believe it was a Ford Europe unit, not an American block Ford engine. So maybe if some other decisions had been made, the outcome could have been different, but regardless, you can't change it now. That's the way it is. And having a tragic backstory to this car kind of adds to the charm, because the performance is fantastic, the look is completely unique, that's for sure, and although the visuals might divide opinion, I personally think it's a great looking machine, and it's certainly a car that deserves to be talked about more. Visually, it reminds me kind of like a mix between the Japanese Dome Zero concept and maybe some of the older Can-Am McLarens or Lolas, like the Lola T70. It's got that kind of vibe to it, at least to me. And personally, I'm a huge fan of the colour as well. I know that's kind of unimportant in comparison, but I do think a nice colour goes a long way on a race car, and this one, it's a bit different. So overall, although it's not a car which has much relevance in the world of, say, racing games or general automotive discussion, it is certainly one which deserves a bit more consideration than it currently has. And ultimately, it is a shame that this car never really had its time to shine. But that's it overall for this particular installment of Unsung Heroes. Of course, I'll see you guys next week with another obscure car that we're going to talk about. And if you want to check out the cars which I've already covered in this series, you can click through to see those at the end of this video. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.